Hello and welcome to the session 7 of the Northwestern Biosafety and Biosecurity Mentorship Program. So under this session, we will look at biorisk assessment. So we've done 6 sessions so far. So we've already looked at the basics of biosafety, biosecurity. Then we've looked at the various documents that you are supposed to have in your facilities, and we've customized these documents in our various facilities. So in session 7, we will kickstart the biorisk assessment session. So for this session, we'll do the part 1 of the biorisk assessment sessions. Of course, as we know, biorisk assessment is one of the core elements if you need to implement a biosafety and biosecurity program in your facility. Therefore, having knowledge on how to go about biorisk assessment and also just having the knowledge, the background knowledge on how to do a risk assessment is very important in each and every mentor as well as the TOTs that we have. So, so in this session, we'll look at the various parts or elements that constitute a biorisk assessment, and then we'll also try to look at some of the resource documents that you can get more information if you need to study further or if you need to create your own program at your own facilities. So by the end of this session, you should be able to describe the process of conducting a biorisk assessment. So, and the next objective or objective 2 is that you need to explain the 5 steps to risk assessment. So what are the 5 steps that you need to follow if you need to do a risk assessment? So these are the 2 major learning objectives, but then we will also touch other aspects of risk assessment as we go in this session. So we'll look at some key definitions here. So these key definitions are some of the definitions or some of the terms that I will constantly use throughout the biorisk assessment sessions. So one of the terms is hazard. So I will use this term mostly during these sessions. So what is an hazard? So an hazard is an object or situation that has the potential to cause adverse effects when an organism, system, or subpopulation is exposed to it. So in the case of laboratory biosafety, the hazard is defined as biological agents which have the potential to cause adverse effects to personnel and or humans, animals, and the wider community and environment. So a hazard does not become a risk until the likelihood and consequences of that hazard causing harm are taken into account. So basically what we were saying is that a hazard is anything that has the potential to cause harm to you. So in the sense of the laboratory, most of the hazards that we have are biological in nature, or the organisms that we are handling in the laboratory. So these are the major hazards that we mostly look at when we're doing a biorisk assessment. And then we're saying these hazards, which is the biological agents, do not become risks until we look at the likelihood of exposure to these biological agents and the consequence that these biological agents will pose if you get exposed to them. So basically, that's a definition of hazard. So incident. So what is an incident? So what an incident is, so this is an occurrence that has the potential to or results in the exposure of laboratory personnel to biological agents and or their release into the environment that may or may not lead to actual harm. So any occurrence either in the laboratory or anywhere that has the potential to result in harm. So it's anything that can cause harm to you. So these may be considered as incidents. So in this case, if you get exposed to biological agents in your lab, or if these biological agents are released, and then if they may lead to harm, or if they may or may not lead to harm, these may be considered as an incident or incidences. So likelihood. So mostly I'll be mentioning likelihood here and then. So likelihood. So what is likelihood? So in a laboratory sense, likelihood is the probability of an incident. So that is exposure to and release of a biological agent. So the probability of an incident occurring in the course of the laboratory. So probability is a mathematical term, as we all know. So probability simply means that something may or may not occur. And also, if it occurs, there's some degree of occurrence to that particular incident that you may be talking about. So when we're talking about likelihood, we're just simply trying to say the probability of an occurrence happening or the probability of an incident happening. So as we know, mostly probability in mathematics, if we look at it from a mathematical aspect, probability can range from 0 to 1, where 0 is that the probability will not, the probability of that occurrence is non-existent, with 1 being that it will most likely happen. But then, as we know, in the laboratory, the incidences that we're mostly referring to are incidences where we get exposed to biological agents. So if we are handling biological agents, there is always a chance or probability that we are going to get exposed to these biological agents. So if we look at likelihood in this sense, it means that likelihood of exposure to these biological agents, if we are handling them in the lab, is never 0. So there's always a degree of chance that you get exposed to these biological agents. But in risk assessment, what we want is to reduce the probability from it being potentially being there to somewhere where we are saying it's rare that you may get exposed to these biological agents. So residual risk. So what is residual risk? So whenever I refer to residual risk, what I'm simply meaning is that this is the risk that remains after you carefully select risk control measures or risk control measures. Yeah. So if you look at the risk and then you've determined or you've selected the risk control measures to either reduce or eliminate this risk, that now the risk that will then remain after you apply your risk control measures is what we are calling your residual risk. So if that residual risk or the risk that remains is unacceptable, it means that you need to put up either extra mitigation measures or you need to enhance your risk control measures. So if you find that after you determine your residual risk and you've exhausted all the risk control measures that you can put up as a laboratory, at that particular point, it's pointing towards you stopping conducting that activity in your lab. It means that you can no longer reduce or eliminate that risk. Therefore, you need to cease operations or you need to stop running that procedure that you're actually running when you're testing for that particular biological agent. So we'll talk about all these in details when we look at the biorisk strategy or the biorisk management strategy. So what is a risk? So a risk is a combination of the likelihood of an incident occurring and the severity of the consequences or the harm, right? So of the consequences if that incident were to occur. So when we're talking about a risk, we're simply saying it's a combination of the probability or the chances of an incident happening. So in the laboratory, we're saying the incident or the occurrence of you getting exposed to the biological agents, or if these biological agents are released to the public which is now a biosecurity type of aspect. So the chances or the probability of that incident happening and the severity if the incident occurs. So the combination of that probability and the consequence after you get exposed to this biological agent or whatever hazard that you may be looking at is what we are calling a risk. So in risk assessment, all we are doing is we are assessing now the levels of these risks, which are defined by the likelihood and the severity or the consequence after exposure. Risk acceptance. So risk acceptance, so the risk that is considered to be acceptable, typically after risk control measures have been applied and allows laboratory work to proceed. So a risk assessment is a systematic process of gathering information and evaluating the likelihood and consequence of exposure to or release of workplace hazards, and determining the appropriate risk control measures to reduce the risk to an acceptable risk. So a risk assessment should be a systematic process, or is a systematic process. What that means is that you need to plan, and then you need to have a procedure as well. Then you need to have a step-by-step systematic way of doing a risk assessment. Then what are you doing in this risk assessment? You are simply just gathering information about a particular hazard. So in this case, the hazard may be biological in nature if we are talking from a laboratory perspective. So that hazard may be biological in nature. So what we're trying to determine is the risk that is posed by this particular hazard. And as we've defined risk is simply a combination of the likelihood of exposure to this biological agent and the consequences if you get exposed to this biological agent. So risk assessment will then also look at what's the course of action or the next steps that you do or you take after you do a risk assessment. So if you find that your risks are unacceptable, which means that your risk may be high or unacceptable, you need to now put up control measures to either reduce or eliminate this risk, so that this risk becomes acceptable. So the main goal of doing a risk assessment is reducing the unacceptable risks to acceptable, so that you continue running in a safe manner in the laboratory. Okay, so let's look at risk a little bit in details. So we'll try to look at or redefine what risk is, but then we've already defined it. So, but then let's just try to look at it from a deeper level. So risk is the likelihood of an undesirable event happening. So this undesirable event this undesirable event involves a specific hazard or threat and has consequences. So what this means is that a risk is the chances of something that you do not want happening, or if you don't want something to happen, so the chances of that thing that you don't want happening, the chances of it happening is part of the risk. So if this particular unwanted, undesirable event happens, there should be some form of consequences after it happens. So if something happens and it has no consequences, it means that that particular event, which is maybe undesirable, may not be considered a risk. So there should always be chances of something happening and the consequence if and when that undesirable event happens. Then also, in terms of mathematics, we can say risk is a function of the likelihood and consequences. Okay, so what does that mean? It means that if you have some numerical values for your likelihood and you have some numerical values for your consequence, so you're talking about the level of chances or the degree of chances having, let's say, a numerical value, and the severity or the consequence after you get exposed, if you have a numerical value for that as well, all you need to do to get the actual risk for that particular undesirable event is you need to get the numerical value for the likelihood and the numerical value for the consequence. If you multiply these two, the product of these two will give you the risk for that particular undesirable event. So we are going to talk about how you do these calculations later on as we start doing either the biosafety risk assessment and the biosecurity risk assessment. So here, all you need to know is that risk is simply likelihood of something that you don't want happening and the consequence if and when this particular undesirable event happens. So biorisk assessment. So what is biorisk assessment? So biorisk is simply a combination of your safety as well as your security risks. So once we say biorisk assessment, we're combining your safety and your security risks. So a biorisk assessment is an analytical procedure designed to characterize and evaluate safety and security risks in the laboratory. So if you characterize and evaluate safety and security risks, this is called a biorisk assessment. And these assessments needs to be analytical. So there should be something you are analyzing. You cannot just end up with a risk without actually analyzing what is leading you to determine that risk. So there should be some form of analysis that is happening before you actually determine the risk levels for either the safety or the security aspects of a laboratory. So every activity and procedure conducted in a laboratory that involves infectious agents should be considered, as well as every asset, every adversary, and every vulnerability within an institution. So you also need to include all the component laboratories as well as units that are in your organization or your laboratory. So you need to look at all the biological agents or all your infectious agents in your lab. So you need to look at the risks that each of these infectious agents poses on you as a person handling them, or the risks that these particular infectious agents poses on the public as well as the environment if it were to be released to them with intent or intentionally. But then also, if we're talking about it from a biosecurity aspect or biosecurity point of view, we also need to look at the assets themselves. So what do you consider to be an asset in your laboratory? What is important in your laboratory? So important that if someone gets that particular biological agent and releases it to people, or people are exposed to it intentionally, it may have some form of high consequence. So you need to look at what are your assets. Then after you look at your assets, you look at, okay, we have these assets. So who are the potential people, or who are the people that may want to come and get these particular biological agents? So these are what we call your adversaries. So these are the people that may want to come and get your biological agents. So your adversaries can either be people that actually are working in that particular lab, or people that may be outside or outsiders that are not part of the organization. So we will talk about the insider-outsider type of scenarios when it comes to adversary, when we start looking at the biosecurity risk assessment. Then also you need to look at the vulnerabilities. So vulnerabilities, so you look at uh, the institution itself where these biological agents are handled. So you look at the areas or the gaps where these adversaries can enter from to come and have access to your assets, which are your biological agents in this case. Also, you need to look at, okay, if they now enter your facility, you look at the security or the vulnerability where these agents are kept. So you look at the freezers, you look at the particular room in which they are kept, and then you look at the conditions in which they are kept and everything. So all these are what we consider when we look at the vulnerabilities. So when we start looking at biosecurity risk assessment, we'll basically look at these three things: the asset, the adversary, and the vulnerability. But for now, basically that's that on what you need to consider every time you're doing either a biosafety risk assessment or a biosecurity risk assessment. So I think I've already touched this part. So there are two types of risk assessments that you can do. So you can either do a biosafety risk assessment or you can do a biosecurity risk assessment. By so doing, if you do a biosafety risk assessment, you're mostly protecting the people from the harmful biological agents. But then if you're doing a biosecurity, you're protecting the biological agents from misuse by the people that may be part of the workforce or outsiders that are coming outside of your facility or institution. So what's the importance of conducting a biorisk assessment? So if you do a proper comprehensive risk assessment, you would have prevented laboratory acquired infection, or you would have reduced the potential laboratory acquired infections that may occur if you do not do a risk assessment, because you would have identified your risks in relation to these biological agents that you're handling in the laboratory, and therefore you would have put up mitigation so that people do not get exposed to these biological agents as they are working with them in this particular lab. Then it protects the environment and the public health. Right? So if you do a proper risk assessment, it means that you would have identified areas where people can have access to these biological agents, and therefore if you've identified the areas and you found gaps, you would have put up risk control measures that will prevent the release of these biological agents to the environment as well as to the public by people that may want to just intentionally expose these environment or the public health. So also it ensures compliance with legal and ethical standards. So if you conduct a risk assessment, risk assessment is one of the requirements if you need to comply to certain standards such as the ISOs and the CWAs. So if you do the risk assessment, at least you would have met some form of standards that are supposed to be met. Then risk assessment also reduces the risk of bioterrorism. So bioterrorism is mostly a biosecurity term. Right? So you would have prevented people actually getting these particular biological agents, and then maybe they may make them into what we call bioweapons. Right? So now if you do a proper risk assessment, you would have prevented someone from coming into your lab, getting these biological agents and weaponizing them into bioweapons. So that's what we call bioterrorism. So bioterrorism is simply the usage of bioweapons to attack people through someone who may just want to harm those people, and therefore they use a bioweapon to just harm them or to cause harm to those people with intent, of course. But then these people mostly will have different motives, as we will see when we start doing the risk assessment, that is the biosecurity risk assessment. So let's look at the risk assessment framework. So in order for you to do a risk assessment, you need you need to follow 5 steps to risk assessment. So these are the 5 steps that you do if you need to do a risk assessment. So these steps are cyclic, which means that if you find that by the end you're reaching step 5, you are not really satisfied that the risks are now acceptable, you go back and start over with step 1. So they are cyclic. So what you want to achieve is that by the time you have done a lot of cycles with these particular steps, all the risks that were unacceptable in your lab should be acceptable at that particular point. So the first step in doing a risk assessment is you need to do what is known as hazard identification. So what is hazard identification? So in hazard identification, what you're simply trying to do is you're trying to identify the different hazards that are in your laboratory or institution. So the different types of hazard that you find in the laboratory are either biological in nature, they can be chemical in nature, or they can be physical in nature. But mostly what we will find in the lab is mostly biological in nature. So mostly you identify your biological hazards, then after that you need to do a risk evaluation. So under risk evaluation, what you are doing is that you are determining the chances of you getting exposed to these biological agents and the consequences or the severity after you get exposed to these particular biological agents. So if you find that the risk, that is if you find that the likelihood and the consequence are high, it means that the risk will eventually be a high risk. So if your risk is high, you need to do what is known as risk acceptance, which we will look at as we go on in the session. So under risk acceptance, what you're doing is you are either accepting the risk that you would have identified, or you are not accepting the risk. So if you find that your risk is unacceptable, is high, or it may be high, or it may be moderate, or it may be low, but then if you find it unacceptable, you need to put up now control measures so that you either reduce or eliminate this risk. So step 3 then comes in. So if your risks are unacceptable, you then need to develop a risk control strategy. So you make a plan to say, for us to reduce this risk to something which is acceptable, we may need to put up A, B, C, D so that we reduce this risk. But then after you plan to say this is what we want to reduce this risk, you need now to implement what you've planned. So now this is where now step 4 comes in. So you may have a lot of risk control strategies, or under your plan, you may have a lot of proposed risk control strategies, but under step 4, you need to now select which ones you think will eliminate or reduce this risk that was identified during your risk evaluation. So now if you select these ones, you need to implement them now. So if you implement these particular control measures, you need to now check whether or not they are actually reducing or eliminating your risk. So this is where now step 5 comes in. So under step 5, you are simply just reviewing and checking, are these control measures actually working? Are they reducing the risk? Are they maybe contributing to the risk becoming more unacceptable? So you need to now review and see, okay, are they working? So now how do you review and monitor? So the best way of monitoring and reviewing your risk control strategies or measures is through the incident management. So if before you did your risk assessment, you had, let's say, 5 incidences that were affecting this particular biological agent, then you say, okay, these particular incidences are being caused because of lack of certain strategies or mitigation measures. Therefore, you say you're going to put up measures to reduce the number of incidences happening. So after, let's say, 2 to 3 months, you need to come and check again. Are you still having the same number of incidences happening, or are you still having the same type of incidences happening? If you find that there's been a reduction in the number of incidences that you're having before and after you did your risk assessment, it means that maybe your risk control measures are actually working, because there has been a proven reduction in your incidences. But then if your incidences have still remained the same, it means that your risk control measures that you implemented are not working. If they've actually increased, that is your incidences, it means that you need new risk control measures. So it means that your measures are not even reducing or maintaining the incidences where they were before. So now you need to do another risk assessment and see where is the problem or where is the risk being increased. Then after that, you put up new mitigation measures that will either eliminate or reduce this risk. So it's, like I said, it's a cyclic type of framework, where if you find that whatever you've implemented is not working, you go back and do your risk evaluation all over again until your risks are all acceptable in your laboratory. So basically, that's the risk assessment framework. So let's look at a real life type of example when it comes to risk assessment. Then after that, we'll relate it to the laboratory setup. So we're going to look at risk when you are crossing a road. So what's the risk when you are crossing a road? Then after that, we'll relate it to the laboratory. So what aspects about you crossing the road will relate to the laboratory? So like we all know, I think since we were children or since we were growing up, we were told before you cross the road, you need to either look right, you look left, then again you look on the right. So that looking right, looking left, and looking right again, you need to do it in that particular order. With you looking right last, not you looking left last. The reason is that mostly, or if not all the time, that's if maybe if you're in Zambia, where drivers usually drive on the left side of the road. If you're crossing a road anywhere in Zambia, vehicles will mostly come from your right side. That is, vehicles that are mostly on the lane where you are, or on the side of the lane where you are. Mostly the vehicles will be coming on your right side, not on the left side. That's why we look right again, so that we check again for the last time, are there any vehicles coming from my right side? So if you look right, you look left, and you look right again. So what are you doing there? So what you're doing there is that you are trying to identify things that or things that may cause harm to you. Right? So you're trying to identify hazards such as vehicles that may hit into you and therefore causing an accident. So the risk there is the risk of the vehicle coming and hitting into you. Therefore, we don't want you to get hit, or you don't want to get hit. Therefore, firstly, what you do is you identify the hazards. So what are the hazards on the road in this case? So the hazards may be vehicles that are on the road. So it may be cars, or it may be bicycles, it may be motorcycles, or anything that can be moving on that particular road. Those are your hazards on that road. But then if you think about it deeper, you will find that these particular hazards are all different. Most of them are different. So you have a car, you have a bicycle, and then you have like a motorcycle. So if you're living in places such as Solwezi, you'll find that there are a lot of these motorcycles that are on the road right now. So all these hazards will pose a different risk. Therefore, the way you cross the road or how you decide to cross the road will be different if what is coming is a car, or if what is coming is a motorcycle, or if what is coming is a bicycle. How you're going to cross will be determined by that particular hazard. So what that means is that each of these either cars or motorcycles have a different risk. Therefore, your action as you cross the road will be different depending on what is coming. So you've done your hazard identification. You're about to cross the road. You've done your hazard identification, and then you've said, okay, there's a vehicle coming on my right, and this vehicle is a car. Let's say it's a Mark X coming from your right. As we know, most of these Mark X drivers will be overspeeding and everything. So the next thing now you need to do is you need to determine the risk of that particular vehicle hitting into you as you are crossing the road. So now, how do you determine the risk of that particular vehicle? So, like we said, risk is about likelihood and consequence. So let's look at just the likelihood. So what is affecting the chances of that vehicle coming to hit you? So there are certain factors that will affect the chances of that vehicle hitting you. One of the factors is how fast that vehicle is moving. So if the vehicle is moving very fast, it means that the chances or the likelihood of that vehicle hitting you will be high. And therefore, if the chances is high, it will affect the risk of you being hit. And most of the time, if you find that the vehicle which is coming on your right is moving very fast, we will not cross the road. We will wait until it passes, and that's when we check from other hazards. If there are no other hazards, then that's when we cross. So one of the things that, like I said, is which is affecting the likelihood is how fast the vehicle is moving. Another thing which is affecting the likelihood is how far is the vehicle from where you are crossing the road. So where you are standing and where the vehicle is, how far is it from where you are? So if that vehicle is speeding and it's near where you are, like it's almost where you're about to cross the road or the point where you want to cross the road, it means that the chances will also increase, and therefore increasing the overall risk. At that particular point, you also need to what? You just need to wait. If that vehicle passes, it means that likelihood of you being hit by that vehicle reduces. If the likelihood reduces, it means that the risk reduces, and therefore you may cross the road at that particular point. So now let's look at consequence. So what are some of the things that will affect the consequence of the risk of you being hit by that vehicle? So one of the things that will affect the consequence is the hazard itself. So what type of vehicle is coming? Is it a light truck, or is it a simple sedan vehicle, or is it a motorcycle, or is it a bicycle? So if what is coming is a truck, it means that the consequence of the risk, or the consequence of you being hit by a truck will be higher as compared to the consequence of you being hit by what? By something which is smaller, such as maybe a Mark X or a motorcycle or a bicycle. So the consequence then will be affected by that. Another thing that will affect the consequence is the speed. So speed is affecting both the chances, then it's also affecting the consequence. So if that vehicle is moving at a very high speed, irregardless of what type of vehicle it is, if a speeding vehicle hits you, the consequence will be greater as when the vehicle is moving at a low speed. So you need to also determine how fast the vehicle is moving. So if you find that the vehicle which is coming is moving at a low speed and then it's very far from you, it means that the risk is low, therefore you can just cross the road and you're on the other side. But then if you find that if it's nearer to you and it's also moving very fast, that will increase the risk and therefore you need to wait. So your mitigation there is that you wait until it passes, then that's when you can cross the road. So basically, that's one of the examples I can give in terms of real life type of risk assessment that we do.